Hello and welcome to NENG 591, Nuclear Weapons and Proliferation. So for this particular lesson, we're going to take a look at the timeline of proliferation through the declared nuclear weapon states, kind of how they went about achieving nuclear weapons. There's several different categories we're going to look at, from espionage to approved cooperation between states to unapproved or back-channel cooperation between states, and indigenous development. Now, I say declared nuclear weapon states because there is one known nuclear weapon state that has never formally declared whether or not they actually possess nuclear weapons, and this is Israel. In fact, they have an official policy of being particularly ambiguous about this. They have several different statements. They actually have a phrase for their particular policy. But because they're not a declared state, whenever we're talking about nuclear weapon states in things like quiz questions and homework questions, we don't put Israel in there. All right, so let's go ahead and start by looking at the timeline for nuclear weapons. Now, as we can see here, the first country to develop and test a nuclear weapon is, of course, the United States, and this was the culmination of effort from the Manhattan Project in World War II. Now, the U.S. wasn't alone in developing nuclear weapons during the Manhattan Project. They were helped by basically scientists from a lot of different countries, from Britain in particular, who was a motivating factor for the U.S. to actually engage in the race to get a nuclear weapon, all driven, of course, by the fear that the Nazis, that Germany, would develop nuclear weapons before anybody else, and would have an extremely deleterious effect on the outcome of World War II. So the U.S. and Britain definitely had a lot of motivation in order to develop functioning nuclear weapons. So 1945, we have the Trinity test at Alamogordo, New Mexico. And then subsequently, we have the first and only two nuclear detonations from a country in hostilities. This is the U.S. detonating both the Hiroshima and the Nagasaki nuclear weapons. For those of you that have taken NENG 596, you'll know that there were two different designs, one called Little Boy, one called Fat Man, and these are gun assembly style for the Little Boy, which is a pure uranium weapon, and then we have an implosion design for the Fat Man, which was a plutonium-based weapon. Now, when we talk about which one of these reasons for development would apply to the United States? So we have sanctioned cooperation, we have unofficial cooperation between nations, we have espionage, and we have what's called indigenous development, which is where the nuclear weapon design information was developed, again, by whatever country that we're going to look at, without being given this information by somebody else or by them stealing it through espionage. So if we're talking about the U.S., it was totally indigenous. This was the very beginning of nuclear weapons. And again, this was done from scientists all over the world that were involved in the project. We have, very famously, we have scientists and mathematicians from some of the occupied states, the Nazi-occupied states in Europe. We have British scientists, we have Canadian scientists, and of course, U.S. scientists. Now, the next weapon detonation, proving that they had the capability, was the Soviet Union, or Russia, and they detonated their first weapon in 1949. Now, if you take a look at a lot of the literature, a big component that's pointed to for the Soviets' first nuclear weapon design was based upon espionage. And that's half true. See, the Soviet scientists were very much capable on their own of developing a nuclear weapon. However, there was a push from within the Soviet Union, from the leadership of the Soviet Union, given that they did have espionage and they did have information on what was going on in the Manhattan Project, to make their weapon as close as possible of a copy to the U.S. weapon, because that was a known design that did work. And Stalin would have considered it pretty catastrophic should the Soviets attempt to test a nuclear weapon and it not go so well and be subsequently detected, and that fact known by its now enemies in the Western countries of the U.S., Britain, France, and the rest of what would become NATO. So yes, they did get some espionage, and it did help them somewhat. Mostly what the espionage that they received helped them to do was to avoid what are called blind paths of research, or going down a blind alley, which yields no results but takes a lot of time. So the espionage that they received was very helpful in that respect. But again, they did take their first weapon that they tested and make it was basically a copy of the Fat Man design. So we have both indigenous, because their scientists did do a lot of research and again would have developed this independently without the espionage. The timeline may have been a bit longer, but they would have done it anyway. So we kind of have two factors in how the Soviets acquired nuclear weapons. So the next country to develop nuclear weapons is, of course, Great Britain, or the UK, in 1952, testing their first weapon. And this was more a result of officially sanctioned cooperation between the United States and Great Britain. It didn't really start out that way. If we look at the Atomic Energy Act of 1946, there was supposed to be no cooperation between the United States and any country with regards to literally anything nuclear. But given that the Brits kind of were responsible for the U.S. Entering into this research area, and protestations from both the UK government and the scientists that worked on the project, on the Manhattan Project, and the fact that these scientists went back to Britain with that knowledge intact, we can pretty much say that a lot of the advances that were made that resulted in Britain testing its first nuclear weapons were in fact from officially sanctioned cooperation. The fourth country to detonate a nuclear weapon is France in 1960. Now, France pretty much was mostly indigenous development, although they did have scientists that had been, in some aspects, involved in the Manhattan Project, but their nuclear scientists had been in the forefront of nuclear physics from before World War II started, so they definitely had the expertise in order to perform the necessary research. And for all intents and purposes, France developed their nuclear weapons independently of everybody else. Now, in the course notes, it says that they had received plutonium and enriched uranium from the UK. I haven't really been able to verify this to any great extent. I think they may have received minute quantities, but nothing that would have pushed them forward in their research program. They did develop and build their own reactors, heavy water facilities, and a lot of the infrastructure that was necessary for their nuclear weapon program, just with the knowledge that they had and knowledge that was available through the international scientific community. So we can just say that France also, indigenous development, they came up with it and developed their weapon programs independently. So now we look at China. Now China developed its nuclear weapons and detonated its first one in 1964. And they're also kind of one of those mixed influences when looking at how their weapon program succeeded. Now they did have some backing from the Soviet Union for definitely while Stalin was still alive. This, of course, fell off later, and we get the Sino-Soviet split, or the Sino-Russo split. So they had their scientists and their engineers were educated in the Soviet Union with regards to all matters of nuclear physics and the nuclear engineering that might be required. However, important to know that they never received any weapon design schematics or any information on actual weapon construction. So while they did receive some, we'll call it unofficial support from the Soviet Union, at least in the early days, their actual weapon design part of their program was developed using information that and knowledge that their scientists and engineers had received through formal training in the Soviet Union. So again, it's more of a half and half mixed bag where they did get some cooperation from the Soviets, but the bit that's the hardest to achieve, which is the weapon design, if you will. That was something that they figured out for themselves. Okay, we have now looking at the next three, India, South Africa, and Pakistan. We can consider almost all of them indigenous development, with the minor exception of Pakistan, where their enrichment technology, that is their ability to create high concentration uranium-235 samples. This was actually from espionage from A.Q. Khan, who had worked for an international uranium enrichment corporation. And he had basically taken a lot of that design information, stolen it, brought it back to Pakistan so that they could develop their own program. And we'll talk a little bit about why these countries developed these programs and why they thought they needed nuclear weapons in a little bit. South Africa, completely indigenous. In fact, they used a uranium enrichment scheme that no one in the world besides them ever used, developed, or used. India, they were kind of on the forefront. When they say it was an indigenous program, that's kind of, again, a little bit misleading, because they did get their initial nuclear technology in the form of heavy water reactors from the US and Canada, and these were used to develop their nuclear program. But again, as far as some, specifically weapon design information and that sort of thing, they came up with theirs independently. And then we come to the last player in the nuclear weapon club, which is North Korea. Now, North Korea also received unofficial, unsanctioned help, but this was both from China and from the Soviet Union, and it was primarily in the form of information and education of their scientists and engineers. That said, they also received unofficial, and again, I am not saying that this is a definite thing, one way or the other, but it's also speculated that their very first nuclear weapon design was in fact a direct copy, or as close to a direct copy as possible, of a Chinese implosion weapon design. And there is speculation that this was provided to them by the A.Q. Khan network, although I've not been able to determine, for one, the absolute validity of that point of view, or how A.Q. Khan or how Pakistan would have gotten their hands on a Chinese nuclear weapon design. So that one is, again, it's pretty muddled, but what it was not definitively was indigenously developed. North Korea received a lot of information, a lot of technology from other states, whether they be nuclear weapon states or non-nuclear weapon states, that definitely, without that, their nuclear program never would have gotten off the ground, if you will. So here's an example of what the traditional thought about Soviet espionage with regards to nuclear weapon looks like. So we have two different nuclear weapon designs here. The one on the left is the Fat Man, or I think it was called the Mark III, and the one on the right is the Joe 1 or RDS-1, which was the first weapon design detonated by the Soviet Union. Now, they are different looking, pretty obviously. One is just matte black, all assembled, so you can't tell anything about it. The Soviet one, the RDS-1, you can see more engineering information just by taking a look at it, looking at bolt placement and a bunch of things. But for all intents and purposes, these were the same weapon. Now, also of interest is the fact that the Soviets' second nuclear test, which was an indigenous design, it was something that their scientists came up with themselves, was actually a much better and higher yield design than the copy of the Mark III, that they initially tested. So they knew what they were doing, and again, just trying to reinforce the fact that it wasn't that the Soviets needed the espionage to develop nuclear weapons. It was something that was prioritized by the Soviet leadership, given the information that they had received from the Manhattan Project. Okay, so that's the nuclear weapon states, the declared nuclear weapon states, and the timeline of when they tested their first nuclear weapons, and kind of looking into how did they get the information to develop their nuclear weapon programs in the first place. So because this is a course on non-proliferation, we must, at the very beginning, take a look at the treaty, international treaty that basically governs the non-proliferation of nuclear weapons. And this is called surprisingly enough, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, or the NPT. Now, as of today, almost every nation on the earth has at least ratified, and most have signed, the Non-Proliferation Treaty. There are a couple of standouts. India never signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty, as they were still developing their nuclear weapons program when the treaty was coming into being, and they would have had to dismantle their entire nuclear program in order to be part of the treaty, and they simply were not willing to do this. The second one that is not in the Non-Proliferation Treaty is Pakistan, and their reasoning and their rationale is, well, if India's not going to sign it, we're not going to sign it, because at some point we're probably going to want, or we are going to develop nuclear weapons. So they're not party to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. The third one is North Korea. Now, they originally were party to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, but ended up withdrawing and testing their own nuclear weapons, and they have ever since not gone back under the auspices of the NPT. Then we have Israel, who has determined that being party to the Non-Proliferation Treaty is not in their best national security interests. And again, because we know they have nuclear weapons, were they to be party to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, outside scrutiny, observations, and inspections would be required, and they certainly aren't going to allow that. And then the final country who doesn't have nuclear weapons, in fact, they're the only country on this list to not have nuclear weapons, that is not party to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, is South Sudan. And as far as I can tell, the reason that they're not party to the Non-Proliferation Treaty is because of their international recognition and status of their country as a country. Because they split off from Sudan. And so official recognition of South Sudan has been kind of up in the air. And so some recognize them as a country, some do not. And because of this, they are apparently not eligible to sign the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So of the 5 that are not signatories, at the very least, 4 countries not party to the NPT have nuclear weapons. So kind of an interesting note. Now, if we take a look at the Non-Proliferation Treaty itself, there are a bunch of articles in there that basically just describe what the treaty is and what the obligations of the treaty signatories are. And we're just going to take a look at a few of these, kind of the most important ones, and a brief description of or explanation of why they're important. So if we look at Articles 1 and 2, this is the treaty stating if you have nuclear weapons and you're party to this treaty, you're not going to give any of that information to a country that doesn't have nuclear weapons. Okay? That's basically what Article 1 says. Article 2 is, look, if you're a non-nuclear weapon state, you're not going to ask anybody or try to acquire nuclear weapon technology or information. That's Articles 1 and 2. If you have them, don't give it to somebody who doesn't. If you don't have them, don't try to get them. Pretty basic. The only problem with this is a really big loophole in this treaty, which is in respects to something called peaceful nuclear explosives, or P&E, and we're going to hit that here in another article, so just hang on a sec. Now, Article 3 states that if you are a non-nuclear weapon state and party to this treaty, then you will agree to have international inspection on any nuclear facilities or infrastructure that you may possess. And this should make sense because not a lot, but there are many countries who are non-nuclear weapon states under this treaty that have a civilian nuclear infrastructure. nuclear energy. So this is just saying for those countries, you're going to let the International Atomic Energy Agency, or the IAEA, which is sort of the watchdog agency of the UN for all things nuclear, you're going to let them have access to all of your nuclear facilities and infrastructure so that they can make sure that you are not trying to develop nuclear weapons on the sly. Article 4 says, look, if you don't have any civilian nuclear technology or infrastructure and you're party to this treaty, then that technology and that information will be made available to you at a significantly reduced cost from having to develop it yourself. And that's why I have this little thing on here. Yeah, we'll give it to you cheap. So this has two ramifications to it. One is it's a promise to non-nuclear weapon states in the treaty that they can be assured that of help in building civilian energy, nuclear energy infrastructure. But it's also, it's a promise to them, but it's also a directive to countries that have nuclear infrastructure, civilian nuclear infrastructure, to share that information with the countries that don't have it. Then we hit Article 5, and Article 5 is kind of the loophole, and it has to do with something called peaceful nuclear explosives. And if you read the text of the article, it says that while nuclear weapon information is not to be shared, that nuclear explosive information that can be used for peaceful purposes, like digging canals or mining or something of that nature, non-military, non-aggressive use, that information obtained by the nuclear weapon states in that particular respect can be shared with non-nuclear weapon states. And it talks about material and technology and information and results of testing. It's a pretty big, broad grouping of things that fall under this. But here's the problem. A peaceful nuclear explosive is still a nuclear explosive. And you must ask yourself, what's the difference between a peaceful nuclear explosive and a nuclear weapon? The answer that I usually give is, well, it's intent, right? A peaceful nuclear explosive is meant for non-aggressive, non-combatant type operations internal to your country so that you can improve infrastructure of some sort, whereas a nuclear weapon is meant to be used against some other nation. But that's just my interpretation of it. So as you can see, it is really a very large loophole, in this treaty as far as the transfer of information that can be used directly to produce nuclear weapons. Now, Article 6, I just put, lol on there. Article 6 is basically saying that the nuclear weapon states have an obligation to reduce their nuclear arsenals, to stop any kind of nuclear arms race, and to eventually completely disarm themselves of nuclear weapons so that the entire world is nuclear free. And the reason I find it hilarious is because there is no extant nuclear weapon state that is going to be willing to do that. The U.S. isn't going to give up its nuclear weapons until it can be absolutely assured that no one else will have them, or, that everybody else that has weapons will absolutely destroy them and never build another one. And that's just not something that you can be 100% on, because even if you were 100% sure at the current moment, being able to predict what's going to happen in the future is impossible. So the U.S. would never do that. Russia would never disarm itself of nuclear weapons. China would never disarm itself of nuclear weapons. And then it becomes very simply a cascade that every nuclear weapon state that's concerned about another nuclear weapon state will not give up its nuclear weapons until that other state does. And again, you go all the way up the chain, and it's just never going to happen. So while it was put here as an article in the Non-Proliferation Treaty, it's been practically ignored. The disarmament piece of it has been ignored by the nuclear weapon states, although both the U.S. and the Soviet Union did engage in a massive drawdown of their nuclear arsenals, and there was a nuclear arms race going on at one point, and both countries backed away from that. Although the argument could be made that it was not because of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, but because it was actually in both countries' best interest to back away from what had been an escalating nuclear stockpile and technology race between the two countries. And then finally, there's Article 10. And Article 10 is just the provisions for a country to withdraw from the Non-Proliferation Treaty should it determine that it is no longer in the best interest of their country to remain party to the treaty. And there's a whole bunch of specifics within there. When we talk about North Korea, we'll look at what those specifics were. But that is pretty much the Non-Proliferation Treaty in a nutshell. In the next set of lessons, we're going to look at what is actually required to build a nuclear weapon, including materials, technologies, testings, and various other components.